Hello, and a very warm welcome to this 1.1ness meditation session. My name is Els, and I'm very happy to be with you here today. For those of you who are new, let me set the context of these sessions, which have been running on Friday mornings, every second Friday now, for the last couple of years. Several of us working for Onepoint Consulting are meditating on a regular basis. The meditation we practice is called Raja Yoga. It's the yoga of the mind. The idea came that it might be good to share some of these practices with a wider audience and to offer these sessions for those in the workplace who are interested in mindfulness and interested in exploring meditation. So far, we've had more than 150 international guest speakers who have contributed to this project. They are experienced meditators from different professional and cultural backgrounds. All the sessions have been recorded and they are available on YouTube. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Benoit Duché, who joins us from France. Benoit is a scriptwriter, a film director, and a producer. He lives in the south of France. He has worked in market research and advertising in Paris, as also having been a vice president and managing director of a French luxury fashion house in New York. Benoit has also exhibited some of his watercolor artworks in a Paris gallery. The topic for today is very interesting. Am I ready to accept my spiritual vulnerability? So very, very warm welcome to you, Benoit.
Yes. How are you? I hope you're fine. Yes. Am I ready to accept my own spiritual vulnerability? This question of spiritual vulnerability is interesting because vulnerability is often seen as a weakness, when in fact it can be a strength in the sense that it can create open-mindedness. And as we will see, the methods we use to try to get over it make us even more vulnerable and sometimes even dependent or subservient. So when talking about vulnerability, one must of course quote Brené Brown, who, as an introduction, says that vulnerability is part of life because life is about uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She mentions in her books, she wrote many books about vulnerability, and she also did some TED Talks, which are quite interesting. And she mentions wholehearted people who attribute their professional or personal success to their ability to be vulnerable and who don't fall in the trap of perfectionism. Brené Brown also describes, all the traps of perfectionism. She says that these people, wholehearted people, believe in their own worthiness and they cultivate authenticity about themselves. They also cultivate self-compassion, resilience, gratitude, intuition, creativity, and laughter. Brené Brown also says, vulnerability means to appreciate the beauty of our cracks or imperfection, because light gets in through the cracks. Vulnerability is the path to become clearer about our spiritual life. I started to appreciate my own spiritual vulnerability when I realized that the most precious part of me is also the most fragile. Well, apparently most fragile. That means the part of me that I have covered with layers of ego because I used to live in a physical consciousness and I identified to my body and probably to relationships based on physical considerations. Spiritual vulnerability starts when I disidentify myself with all my previous masks and beliefs. But then I have to disidentify from the fear that that process might create. Fear is necessary to protect myself from a danger, just as stress is a boost that my body creates to give me additional energy to face a special situation. And if you want to know more about stress, I advise you to go and see the TED Talk that Kelly McGonigal gave on the topic. Quite interesting. Guilt often reaches the ones who are trying very hard to follow a code of conduct which they find unnatural because they have identified for too long with the wrong part of themselves, or because they have forgotten the most precious part of themselves, which is the spiritual one. Spiritual vulnerability means that I'm putting down the scaffoldings I have built around me over the years to falsely protect myself. I decide to walk without the crutches. When I realize I don't need them anymore, I also need to replace them by something more real, more natural, more sustainable, something truer to who I really am. What can that be? That's what I did personally. Long time ago, when I quit my job in New York to look for the essential, quote unquote, essential, whatever that might be. So I started to read books I had never read before, like, spiritual masters and the Bhagavad Gita and Carl Jung and Mircea Eliade and all kinds of people. Then I tried Hatha Yoga and mindfulness, careful to avoid sex and cults. I left religion on the side as I have been brought up with it. It was fine, but, okay, what else is there out there? So I did all the postures and I concentrated on my breathing and I created the void in my mind and I tried to be Zen and so on and so on. And at the same time, I started some form of artistic expression, music, painting, dancing. That was great. And New York was a wonderful place for that. But it was not quite that yet. But this shows that I had accepted to move on with an open-minded and in a vulnerable way. That is, moving ahead fully on the basis of my intuition and deploying my antennas. But somehow there always remains some inner contradictions. Spiritual vulnerability means to stop fighting with oneself, fighting with my own habits, with my belief system, with my wandering mind, with my desires. So, two ways to stop fighting with my own contradictions. Either by stopping the guilt every time I'm being mischievous, meaning every time I keep following my habits, my desires, my wandering mind, etc. Because, hey, I'm in control, that's what I think. Or the other way is to become completely aligned with my true self in my actions, my words, and my thoughts. Spiritual vulnerability means, am I ready to lose control? But actually, what did I really control? Not outside events and situations happening to me. They just happen. Did I control the way I'm affected by them? The law of karma that many people talk about is not in the event itself, but in the way I make those situations belong to my life and my consciousness. The way I make them invade my mind. The way I make them trap me in the web I have built around them due to my limited consciousness, my fear, or my guilt. Then I start to have doubts about myself, about life, about God, etc., and I suffer. Then I go into damage control, and I even believe that the more I suffer, the better it is. And yes, we know, don't we, that suffering is indeed a means of realization and transformation. But is it the best way? And do I have to suffer? Does controlling mean that I have to make things heavy and difficult? Is there another way around? Actually, there is. In a very subtle spiritual dimension, the best way to control is to let go. Stop fighting the spiritual laws. at last do what's required of me, do what I have to do in terms of fulfilling my spiritual responsibilities and staying all day long in the right consciousness with the right attitude of benevolence towards the world, my neighbors, and myself. Forget the differences. See the beauty of the souls. Fear of guilt comes from a lack of faith in myself and in the one I would call my spiritual friend. I have a spiritual friend who whispers to my ear and says, look, all you have to do is put your consciousness on me. Remember me as often as possible, and I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You'll see everything will be fine. So why don't I do it? Precisely because I lock myself in my worries, in my little problems of my daily life. Problems that I sometimes create myself or that I rush headlong onto. Sorry. When in reality, my spiritual friend has been telling me for years, place your conscience on me, raise your consciousness. And from the moment I raise my consciousness, what used to be problems or worries are suddenly set back in their right perspective, in their right context. And from that moment on, problems and worries lose their validity, they lose their power, they lose their influence over me. And I realized that all this is not much in the end. And that indeed, if I have faith in myself, and if I have faith in the big theater play, quote unquote, in the course of the play, all these situations are at best gifts, not even obstacles, but gifts to allow me to understand what it's all really about. So obviously, to do this, first of all, I must have a great trust in this spiritual friend of mine, so that I accept to stop trying to control everything. Spiritual vulnerability is when I accept to place myself in an attitude of being a relay, an instrument. Because in reality, this vulnerability, which I believe to be fragile, is going to give me greater strength. Whereas what I thought was a strength until then, that is to say, the masks, the ego, and all these kind of barriers that I created around me, in fact, only did one thing, and that was to weaken me all the more. For the Stoics, there is what I can act upon and what I cannot act upon. You know, Epictetus talked about those things in our power and those things which are not. And that's where it gets interesting, because I can control what I can act upon. But when it comes to what I cannot act upon, that's where my spiritual friend comes in, because he or she can act on a subtle level. But for that to happen, there is one condition. My spiritual friend can only do his work properly if I'm aligned. Because it's only when I'm aligned with myself, with my powers, my virtues, and everything in my attitude, my intentions, my behavior, my actions, my words, and my thoughts, only when I'm aligned with myself do I also become aligned with the big theater play. And when I'm aligned with the big theater play, I fully play my part. Nobody has created that theater play. Nobody runs it, nobody can change it, but my spiritual friend knows the beginning, the middle, and the end of it. And he knows each one's part in it. He's like the director who observed the theater play. Actually, my spiritual friend doesn't work on the physical level, but he has outpost instruments, and those instruments can inspire my fellow actors in the play. So we are like diamonds who receive a very bright, very pure white light that we can then refract in many colors or many wavelengths, from infrared to ultraviolet, so that everyone can get what they are ready to receive. And of course, the purer the diamonds, the larger and the clearer is the spectrum of light that it can refract. In my own experience, when I do everything I can on the things I can act upon, like putting together an application for a job or preparing the interview and all that kind of things, then I know that the result, will I be admitted or not, is not in my hands anymore. And if I push things too much, if I become pushy, I take a big risk of actually destroying what I had built before. Whereas if after having done everything in my power, I let go, that is, I accept my vulnerability in the face of the situation, then I let all the subtle powers out there in the subtle dimension handle the result on my behalf. And most of the time, it works. The famous law of attraction that, again, everybody talks about, says that if you take the necessary steps and if you live in alignment with your goals, then you will bring them to life. And it also says, always remember that at a certain point, it's important to surrender and let what they call the universe take the wheel. Spiritual vulnerability for me was particularly acute when I met Raja Yoga. Well, in fact, it will be 40 years ago next August. Because on top of meditation, Raja Yoga gave me another way to look at essential things of life, like time, who am I, where do I come from, where am I going? It gave me a new understanding about God and the consequences of my actions, my words, and even my thoughts. And instead of rejecting this new vision of life and of the world, I chose to reconsider everything I knew, which of course put me in a very vulnerable situation. Suddenly, I had to challenge everything I knew. And that's how I say that spiritual vulnerability creates open-mindedness. I already had some intuition about some of the aspects I was told, but other aspects were very surprising. In fact, I wrote a book at the time in order to go deeper into this new knowledge. And I realized that even though it was different, it was also coherent. And that's what I liked. If I had remained stuck in my preconceived convictions, if I had rejected everything I was told, I don't know where I'd be today. Maybe in New York, maybe married or divorced, with or without children, rich or poor. But one thing is sure, I'd be very depressed because I would still be searching for the deep meaning of life. And that's what really I wanted. That's what I found, and it is essential. But in order to find it, I had to place myself on a vulnerable spot in a situation of spiritual vulnerability, which is very rich and very beneficial once you have been over the first feeling of discomfort that it can create. So let me do with you today an awareness exercise, if you wish. So, I place myself in my inner space, that space which belongs to me, that space that nobody can invade, that space which is very peaceful. And while being in my inner space, I realize that I am an actor in the big theater play. I play my part at best I can, as I keep a high consciousness while doing the simple gestures of daily life. And like every good actor, before getting on stage, I feel very vulnerable. But then, once on stage, I play my part with confidence. I interact with my fellow actors, and I fully integrate in the decor or the scenery. And once the play is over, I become my own self again. But if I identify with my role, then I get trapped into trying to control something artificial, where I feel I need to wear masks. Those masks make me dependent on a fake self, on the ego. Vulnerability goes with being open-minded, spiritually open-minded. Spiritual vulnerability doesn't mean to be dependent on others or even on one's own instincts. Spiritual vulnerability means that I'm ready to see and accept my subconscious, to integrate it, which is the famous concept of individuation, that Carl Jung talked about. Means that I have to integrate my inner imprints, which we call sanskars, my inner imprints of anxiety, of fear, of guilt, of shame, my deepest desires, and so on, and as much as possible, to make my subconscious conscious. When I have integrated my subconscious, I become a full being. That is, I become myself again. If I'm still fighting my own vulnerability with masks and ego, it means I have not understood who I really am, who my spiritual friend is, and mostly how the big theater play of life works. That's what I wanted to talk to you about today concerning spiritual vulnerability. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it gave you some insight about who you really are and, what is the most precious part of yourself. Thank you. Up to you, Els.
Thank you, Benoit. That was very inspiring. And I liked how you called the meditation session an awareness exercise. I'd never thought about meditation as awareness exercise, but that's in fact what it is. And also how you explained that I need to put down the scaffolding that I've built in my life and let go of the crutches. I think that's such an important awareness, such an important thing to look at. But then also you talked about how to connect with that spiritual friend, have faith in myself, have faith in the universe, this big theater, and to have that feeling that everything will be fine. So really very, very nice. Thank you so much, Benoit, for sharing your thoughts on this. Those of you who have joined us today, I hope you have enjoyed the session. We're looking forward to welcoming you again at the next 1.1 session. And bye-bye to everyone. Have a very nice day. Thank you, Benoit. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.